Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you for joining us for part 2, Designing Inclusive Preschools, Discover, Data, Design, Deliver, presented by author and educator Andratesha Fritzgerald. I'm Kristen Brooks, Executive Director with the Supporting Inclusive Practices Project. And on behalf of Co-Director Kevin Schaefer, our team out of both Riverside and El Dorado County Offices of Education and the California Department of Education, we are glad you are here to engage with us again. We have many participants on the line with us who can participate in this session using the chat or the Q&A features, where we have team members monitoring throughout. If you miss any portion of this session or future sessions, you will receive a link to the recording and related resources in a follow-up email to the address you provided when you registered. It's also posted on the Padlet in the link that we'll drop for you now into the chat. So please be sure to check your junk or spam folders if you don't see the email come through in the next 24 hours. A Padlet link is being dropped, as I mentioned, in the chat that contains the session materials and related resources for today. You'll see a link for the slide deck of today's presentation that is interactive. So be sure to either open that in a new browser window or have the Padlet handy when our presenter references the interaction opportunities. So we'll be sure to add that Padlet link to the chat a few times in case it gets lost in our engaging commentary. So with that, here is your presenter, Andratesha Fritzgerald.
Thank you, Kristen. Thank you to all of you who have worked to bring this event together. For those who are returning from session 1 to session 2, thank you for rejoining. And for those who are using the on-ramp of session 2 to jump in today, you are welcome here. You know, as I was thinking and preparing for today's session, this is where data meets design. We can know the numbers, we can know the statistics, we can know all of the ways that the charts trend, but if it doesn't change our practice, then we are simply perpetuating the past over and over again. And so today we will talk about anti-racism and universal design for learning as a function of when data meets design, when we know who we're serving well and who we're not serving well, when we find out what those barriers are to student success. Do we simply allow those barriers to stay, or do we eliminate those barriers? And that's what we'll talk about today. But I wanted to begin a little bit differently than I have in the past. And on my mind lately has been a poem by Tupac Shakur. And it's called The Rose That Grew from Concrete. And maybe you've heard it before, but Tupac is best known for his rapping. He was a rapper in the 90s, and he was killed by gun violence, still an unsolved murder. There's lots of theories about it. One of my best friends, she would collect these articles, and she has all these theories on who did it and why. She could give an entire session on that, but I won't do that today. But what I do know about Tupac is that he is a very complex character who has been painted with just one single stroke. People see him as a thug and they label him all different kinds of things. But what they don't know about him, and if you do know him, I'm so happy to share this with you. He was a poet. He was a champion for the arts. In fact, he attended the School of the Arts in Baltimore. And while he was a student there, he loved Shakespeare, and he was hopeful that his poems one day would be studied in the way that Shakespeare studied and dissected and learned about. And so he hoped that his life would do that. So today I hope to honor his legacy. What I learned about him as well is that he was an actor. Of course, he was in some movies in the late 90s, but he also took ballet, and he was a pretty good dancer as well. So very well-rounded, very multifaceted. And I wondered about him in preschool. I wondered what labels were placed on him. I wonder what box they tried to push him into. I wonder, was he free? Did he have room to explore? Did he feel confident and comfortable in himself? And so that he could emerge as the full star that he's always been. And so it took me to this poem today that I would like to share with you. And it's called The Rose That Grew from Concrete. Did you hear about the rose that grew from a crack in the concrete? Proving nature's law is wrong. It learned to walk without having feet. Funny it seems, but by keeping its dreams, it learned to breathe fresh air. Long live the rose that grew from concrete when no one else ever cared. How many roses are growing from concrete? How many children are finding the fresh air despite the barriers, despite what is going on around them or what people think of them or expect from them? Our job here is not to celebrate the concrete, nor to keep it in place, but to blast away at every barrier that keeps each rose from blooming, from finding its way, from breathing fresh air, from learning to walk. And today we will talk about universal design for learning and anti-racism together. So glad that you are here today. So I'm going to share my screen because I think I can see it, but I don't think that you can. And the link will be shared in the chat periodically. So if you're just joining us, there are many opportunities to hop in. So just be patient with us as we meet your needs. So let us know what you need in the chat and we will be with you. So I'm just gonna make sure the chat is up there. Thank you, Juliet, for putting that in. All right, and my name is Andratesha Fritzgerald. I am an educator, an author, an activist. I wrote a book called Anti-Racism and Universal Design for Learning, Building Expressways to Success. And so this metaphor of the road or the student or the learner as a driver, you'll hear throughout the presentation. And so I will walk you through a little bit of last session before we dive in to this session. But if you've ever been in any session with me, this is your invitation to personalize. So I would just like you to assess yourself. How ready for learning are you? Are you foggy, unclear, not kind of ready? That would be a 0. My body is here, my brain is not welcome. That's a 0. If you are focused, totally ready and attentive, that's a 5. And the pictures kind of match that from foggy to totally focused. 0 to 5, go ahead and rate yourself in the chat. You already are off to a running start. We got some 3s, some 4s. If you're at a 0, a -3, wherever you are, 100% of who you are is welcome here. This is a judgment-free zone. And so I want you to take the next 15 seconds without the sound of my voice to personalize your learning environment. Open tabs, close them, pull out a notebook, pull out your markers to sketch note, maybe send that last text, turn the phone on or turn it off, stir whatever the pot, take care of the fur baby. No matter where you are, if you're in the school building, maybe you need to grab a snack, maybe you need to just stand up and stretch. Take 15 seconds without the sound of my voice to personalize your learning environment, to move yourself from wherever you are just a little bit closer to 5, ready to focus, ready to learn. 15 seconds, go. Five, 4, 3, 2, 1. Thank you all. And so here's some rules of the road today. And then if you would love to share maybe something that we would benefit from as a rule of the road, please share that in the chat. You are welcome here. And I don't know if there are very many spaces where 100% of you has been invited or welcomed in. What you know is welcome here. What you don't know is welcome. The right terminology, the wrong terminology, we're here as a safe space, and we can only make this true if all of us agree that we will be safe together, that we'll learn from each other, but we'll push each other. We'll help one another. You decide how you'll capture your learning, whether you need to take notes or use the Padlet or create a Google Doc or a Jamboard for yourself. However it is that you need to capture your learning, you are free to do that. Be intentional about affirming the voices of others. This takes the pressure off of you being right or saying the right thing. But when you hear something, when you see someone in the chat, you can affirm them, maybe a +1, or maybe just giving them a inbox, a private message to say, you know, I was wondering that same thing. Find ways to connect in the affirmative. And then last but not least, allow a little bit of your voice to enrich the community. Ask questions, share thoughts, make connections. This is your space to learn, and we get to learn and grow. And even if you are watching this video after the fact, there are a number of ways that you can still connect. On the interactive slides, if you are using those, you can still give your answers, type your responses, or draw there. I still will be able to interact with you. Communally, we'll be able to interact together. And through the Padlet, you'll be able to see some resources. So we are community. Whether you are participating synchronously or asynchronously, there is space for you. There is a design with you in mind. So thank you for being here today. We have 3 goals for this session, and that's to understand and apply developmentally appropriate ways to incorporate anti-racism and UDL into the early childhood curriculum, instruction, and assessment practices. And you'll hear a number of ways that you can do that today. And I want you to think about your own classrooms, your own systems, your own places where you serve, your role, and how you can incorporate these things. So there is some time for you to dig in. The second is to understand how labels and biases and stereotypes can be addressed to build more equitable and inclusive learning environments. And we'll transfer some learning from our first session over to our second session so that we can bring in some of those same ideas and expand on those. And next, we'll play with UDL as a tool to create belonging and equity for children with historically marginalized identities. And so today, there's an invitation to play, to think a little bit about what that design looks like in your learning environment and to share some of your play with others. And so our last session began with the definition of a picture. Picture is defined as to capture or create an image of a person, an object, or a scene to visualize something. And it also is a noun, a representation of anything, a person, a landscape, a building on a canvas. And we talked about the pictures that are created with the data. And so one of the things that we reflected on was what image has been captured or created for students with disabilities in California. And we saw that there was a difference between what the students expected as an outcome and what they actually experienced as an outcome, that there was some dissonance in between what they want and what we're preparing them for. And so we looked at the inclusion rates and we saw that the percentage of preschoolers with an IEP who received the majority of their special education services in a regular early childhood program was trending upward, then it went down, and then we're kind of at a plateau. Ultimately, we want to see more learners with IEPs educated in the regular early childhood program. And so if this is what we envision, if this is the picture we want to capture, then what changes do we need to make in order to design instruction, assessment, and curriculum that captures every learner's interests, that supports every learner fiercely, and that challenges each learner from right where they are? And so we looked at some other data about what the expectations were. And so we saw that 74% of youth with autism expected to obtain post-secondary education. And about close to 50% of youth with intellectual disability expect to obtain post-secondary education, but in actuality, only 23% of adults with an intellectual disability completed a program with a certificate or a degree. And so as we look at those post-secondary outcomes, along with the segregation that's occurring in early childhood, we have to walk backwards and look at this data and introduce it to our design, because there once upon a time is not turning into the happily ever after that they envision. And the connection between the two is us. It's the work that we do. And so we took a walk up the pyramid, and I'm just recapping session 1 just briefly in order to give you an on-ramp into session 2. We talked about walking up this pyramid to return to school. In order to take care of children, you have to take care of you. And as an educator, part of taking care of you, part of making sure that your instruction is safe for others is self-care, self-awareness, self-reflection, but also self-leadership. So what biases, what decisions are you making for your learners without knowing them fully? Where can you entrust more decision-making power to them while releasing your own preconceived notions, prejudices, biases? And so as we begin session 2, I am going to introduce you to Richie Parker. Maybe some of you have heard of him before. If you've heard of Richie Parker before, just put a 0 in the chat. And I see that there is a hand raised, and I'll pause here. Is there a question that we need to address?
Hey, Andratesha, we had that happen a couple times. I think people are accidentally hitting the hand raising button instead of maybe the Q&A or the chat button.
All right. Well, Again, 100% of who you are is welcome here. This video sometimes gives me a couple of issues, but let's hope that today is our day that it doesn't. So I am looking at a commercial. I don't think you can hear it. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, so let me stop share. This is your, oh, I am not seeing my controls. Here we are. Okay, I'm gonna reshare. I love this. And for the recording, this lets you know that this is a live, this is captured in front of a live, not studio audience. I've always wanted to say that this is my chance. Okay, here we go. And can you see my screen?
Yes.
All right. And hopefully you
An
can hear.
unstoppable
Is that a yes?
spirit. A man who is truly the engineer of his own success, from learning how to brush his teeth to designing the fastest cars on the planet, despite a handicap he's had since birth. From our sister network ESPN, ABC's John Donvan looks at how one man tougher than a turbocharged engine is America strong.
He's been going all his life because he's figured out what a shoulder can do, what a foot can do, what a chin can do to get him on the road. And though he's as safe a driver as there is, it's as if Richie Parker has never seen a stop sign.
I don't know that there's a whole lot in life, period, that I could say that I can't do. Just things that I haven't done yet.
Like how he makes his living, an engineer designing high-performance cars, the ideas that come from his head then play out at racing high speed on the NASCAR circuit. He's on the team at Hendricks Motorsports, the most winning designer in NASCAR.
We sat down and he showed me how he works on the computer and how he does his design work. I write with my right hand, you write with your left hand. He happens to write with his feet.
Who would have guessed when he was born back in 1983 in Beaufort, South Carolina?
You know, he was the cutest little boy.
The doctor pulled his dad aside
And said the baby did not have arms. And I just was sort of dumbfounded, like, what do you mean?
It meant engineering solutions, as his mom said.
We wanted his childhood to be as close to any other child's childhood as possible. That's always been our attitude. We are going to make it work.
We put this on the door.
Where it turned out that Richie himself was chief engineer. Watch Richie the kid back then figure out how to open the refrigerator.
Pull it out.
Or long before learning to drive, how to get going on a bike that his dad rigged with extra long handlebars.
And that's what we use for.
Or nowadays, how to have a meal using that classic handheld device, the spoon. So yeah, speed bumps sometimes, but no stop signs.
I had two parents that from day one tried to make it so that my life was, I guess you could say, as normal as possible, whatever normal is.
Well, really, this is better than normal. This is America Strong.
Thank you all for your patience. The closed captions also decided that they were not going to work for me. So let's make sure that I'm in the right one. Okay. And so as we think about this notion of engineering solutions, the spirit of inclusion and belonging was kind of embodied by his mother's comment that we are going to make it work. We are going to make it work. And when we empower our learners to be the chief engineer of solutions for themselves, that means that the options open doors, that create the open doors. So as you reflect on Richie Parker, on the ways that he engineered solutions for himself, what takeaways can we apply to the early childhood setting? Go ahead and you can type in the chat. No stop signs, positive regard, that we never underestimate, that we have to trust children, no assumptions, where there's a will, there's a way, belief in the possible. Yes, let's show them what they can do, The power of yet, high expectations and possibilities. Yes, thank you all, that they can do anything. No limits, keep pushing forward, risk taking. Give them the power to teach us to prioritize individual considerations, learn independence, help to adapt. Don't label, see the able, not the label. We can figure out more opportunities. No boundaries, fast forward. Yes, allow. And so as we open up the door, as we begin to discuss universal design for learning, I want you to keep the picture of Richie Parker in mind, that adding length to the handlebars gave him the opportunity to learn how to ride a bike. And he took that same ingenuity and he's able to drive a car. And so when we think about our curriculum, what supports would enable learners to reach the outcome? Of course, the outcome didn't change. The standard is not lower once Richie drives the car. He still has to obey the traffic rules and watch out for the different traffic. He has to obey the same laws that everyone else does. And he's able to meet the same standard with supports, with changes and modifications. And so think about our curricula. Think about our design. Think about our assessments. Are we providing the environment that brings about innovation, that allows students to take the support they need in a way that is not villainized or criminalized in any way, to take the support that they need in order to reach the standard, to meet the goal, to exceed expectations? And that is the spirit, or the spirit of inclusion and belonging that we want to capture today, as we allow our data and our outcome, what students want, what they expect for themselves, to drive us, to move us forward in our quest for designing for them to meet those goals. And so we talked about in session 1 that segregation does not and cannot lead to belonging. And so what we do today has an impact on tomorrow. And as we take a look at the data, when we look at our design, the question that is the linkage between the two is, we looked at the outcome data, we looked at the post-secondary expectations, we looked at the trends that there is less inclusion, and we looked at the outcomes post-secondary that learners were experiencing. And the question that we're led to kind of reminded me of a chart that they use at some of the doctor's offices when they ask you to identify where the pain is. So we can look at the data, we can look at the test results, we can look and see where the pain is. But the question after the doctor runs the test and does the blood work and has that appointment with us and really hones in on what the issue is does it hurt? Whatever it is, whatever the pain is, whatever the trouble is it hurtful enough for us to change? In a medical case, if it is a person who's had a cardiac episode and they're alive to tell the story, does that pain of the cardiac episode hurt enough to change your eating habits, your diet, your exercise regimen? Does it hurt enough for you to change the things that will lead to a different outcome? Well, for our data, as we look at those post-secondary outcomes, as we look at more and more students being educated in a separate setting than the regular education setting, then we have to ask ourselves, when we look at what students with disabilities expect from themselves, what they want to accomplish in life, what they want to succeed in, and we are not preparing them for that path, we have to ask ourselves, does it hurt enough for us to change? Does it hurt enough for us to change? And so I want you to take a look at this picture, and I'm going to describe it for you. And if you are using the interactive slides, you can circle any place on the picture where you see danger. And so tell me, where do you see danger on the road? You can type in the chat, or you can circle it on the interactive slides. Where do you see danger here? And I'll give you a couple of minutes just to process, take a look. Where do you see danger on this road? Corners on the other side under the bridge. Here, oh, there's where you're turning the corner, where the bridge is. Their cars are really close. There is tailgating happening here. Thank you. Dogs and people on the road. There's someone just standing here. Animals in the road. Cars off track, dog on the road. People are too close. No rails to protect here. Behind the large truck, there's blind spots. Absolutely. No crosswalk, but crossing is happening. This road is dangerous. The positioning of the signs. And so as you look, Lisa said there's danger everywhere you look. There's some unsecure items on top of a car that is passing over, and there is no guardrail here. There's some distraction going on down at the bottom here. I'll turn on my pointer. There's some distraction going on here where the police have pulled someone over, but they're not really to the side of the road. If you look, the roads are really, really narrow. There's an underpass here. Someone mentioned the dog there. I don't know if this is a pothole or roadkill. I really can't tell. But if we look at this road, it is easy to point out where it is dangerous. It is narrow, that two cars, they have two lanes, but two cars can't fit. There are people, there are animals, there's distraction. There are no protection, no traffic signals. There's a couple of signs, but ultimately we can point out the dangers of the road. But what I would like to really focus on is that the design of this road is dangerous. The design of this road is dangerous. And so many times with curricula, with instruction, we can point out dangers. We can point out a lesson that didn't go well. We can point out if students didn't receive what we were trying to give. But very rarely do we take a step back and see if the design of our classes, our classrooms, our systems, our routines, are they dangerous? And are they dangerous for groups with a historically marginalized identity more so than their white counterparts? Are students with disabilities who are also students of color in a more dangerous position because our design does not account for them and for their travel and for their learning and for their comfort and for their belonging and inclusion? And so if the design is dangerous, we can stick in some safety measures here and there, but if the design itself is dangerous, then the outcomes will be hazardous for those who are in danger. And so I want you to just take a moment, and I'm gonna give you a moment to just reflect on your own classroom. And as we talk about anti-racism, think about your own school, your own district. In my book, Anti-Racism and Universal Design for Learning, I share a chart, and I think it's on pages 4 through 9, but I also created a resource for schools, and we'll make sure we add it to the Padlet, and it is free to download. Of course, you have to buy the book, but the resource for evaluating your school district for anti-racism and universal design for learning is free to all districts because this work is very important. And so I'm just going to ask you a few questions that I want you to consider as we dig through. And I left the slide in this way so that you could write your own responses. So I didn't put any pictures with it because I wanted you to be able to write or type for yourself. So when you think about power and honor, which we talked about in session 1, if you haven't watched it, make sure you go back and watch session 1. Are Black and Brown and Indigenous voices reflected in the curriculum? Is there evidence of power? Is there evidence of honor? And if you see that that's not really reflected in your curriculum, what are your next steps? This is an action-oriented session. And so are Black and Brown and Indigenous teachers and leaders in the system, if the representation for Black and Brown and Indigenous teachers and leaders is really low, then as a system, have you paused to ask why or why not? And then what are your next steps? Has there been a concerted effort to have continuing self-reflective conversations about anti-racist policies and practices? If there haven't been, then this is a micro insult that says race doesn't matter, and that's a point of privilege. And so if we pause to think about how does this work intersect students with disabilities who are students of color? In what ways has our system paused to think about how we could better serve those students who have historically been marginalized? Are we acknowledging the work of promoting justice, that restorative practice in meaningful ways in our system, or are we punishing the same students over and over again? Do we include speakers who model academic excellence and attainment for Black, Brown, and Indigenous learners? Does the system value and protect those who speak out against racism, who speak out against racist jokes or racist comments or oppression of any kind? Are Black, Brown, and Indigenous students receiving honors and academic accolades? And the flip side of that is, are they only reduced to their entertainment value or what they provide on the sports fields? These are hard questions to wrestle with as an organization. Does every student have knowledge of and access to the tools, resources, and supports for success? Or are we keeping success a secret society? How do you know? Is there evidence of power? Is there evidence of honor? And what are your next steps? And is there a real connection to the community? Are Black, Brown, and Indigenous people welcome in your school and in the school system? Has there been a concerted effort to gain insight from Black and Brown people to design curricula, systems, and supports? Does that sound like your system? Does it sound like you've paused to wrestle with these questions in the preschool setting? Have you thought about how these questions impact your anti-racist efforts? And if these are not your reality, then your next step is to find out, what do we need to do to begin asking ourselves the questions as we meet the needs of our learners? And so when we think about universal design for learning, and we're going to jump into what UDL looks like, I want you to think about UDL through the lens of equity. How can we design learning systems that really meet the needs of all learners? And so these are some pictures from the district that I serve. And so as students play and learn, as they try and grapple together, how do we celebrate them? How do we give them space to celebrate themselves? How do we give them space for that social emotional learning? All learning is social and all learning is emotional. How do we have them bring 100% of who they are to reading and writing, to trying new things for gross and fine motor skills, to math, to science? How do we give choice? How do we build that in to where we are? And so tonight, I won't give you all the answers, but I will help you think about the questions that will lead you to your next steps. In 2005, I believe, Philip Schlechte of the Schlechte Center created this images of school chart. And I learned about it a couple years ago, and he has a guiding metaphor in each level. And so he talks about the core business of a school that is a learning organization. And there is a metaphor that goes up this continuum. So it goes from prison to warehouse to factory to professional service delivery organization to a learning organization. And so I found this to be really interesting because it goes across and it describes what students are, parents, teachers, principals, superintendents, school boards, and what that classroom looks like at different levels. And so at the prison level, students are inmates, and the core business is containment, monitoring, corrective action, and punishment. Parents are viewed as distrusted visitors. Teachers are guards, just keep the inmates under control. The principal is a warden, and the superintendent is a bureau chief, department directors, hearing officers, and parole officers. Do you see how the metaphor extends? In that classroom that is like a prison, conflict is habituated, and students develop negative attitudes toward disciplined learning. And so that is what a prison looks like. And that is that metaphor. I'm just gonna move up to factory. So in a factory, the student is raw material or product, number 43231. The parent is a supply source. We need more students to equal more money. And they also determine the product quality. So we just ask them over and over, good or bad, good or bad. The teacher is a skilled worker. So they have, you know, some skill that they lend to this factory, but the principal is a foreman. The superintendent is a plant manager. The school boards are owners, and the classroom is probably passive and congenial, meaning that not much is happening here, but everybody's smiling and, no trouble. And the level of learning is they understand, but unlikely to remember long-term. This is a factory. Think assembly line. We come in, we get school done, and then we go home. I'm going to move up to a learning organization. And in a learning organization, a student is a volunteer and a knowledge worker. What does that mean? That when we design instructional experiences, that we are working to earn the commitment and attention, working to earn their commitment and attention, and they are free to give it or to withhold it as a knowledge worker. Our core business is designing engaging academic work for students and leading them to success in that work. And that success is defined by them. The parent is a partner and member of the school community. And in session 3, we'll talk a lot more about how do we create classrooms and schools where parents are partners and not distrusted visitors. How do we see the teacher? The teacher is the leader, designer, and guide to instruction. Principal is a leader of leaders. Superintendent is a moral and intellectual leader, a capacity builder. And then the school board is a community builder, advocate for the schools. And the classroom is highly engaged. That means high attention, high commitment. Students are doing work that is of value to them. And there's creativity, there's evaluation, analyzing, applying, understanding, remembering. And this is a learning organization. And so to me, a learning organization embodies universal design for learning, keeping in mind that anti-racism, that anti-oppressionism, that anti-ableism, and really working with each member of the community to wrap our arms around the learners so that they can get to the destination that they choose for themselves. A prison is just to contain. A learning organization is to set free. And so I want to give you a chance, if you're using the interactive slide, you can move the dot to where you see yourself. So if you're in the role as teacher, what do you think about your own role in the system where you are? If you are a parent, you can move the dot there. If you're a principal or a school leader, think about where do you see your system and where do you see your role? So go ahead and take just 1 minute to reflect. And then I'm going to pop over to the interactive slides to see as a community where we are there. And judgment free. Wherever you are, then you can set a goal for where it is that you want to go. So thank you all for sharing and reflecting there. This chart, again, is from the Schlechte Center. They have a bunch of amazing resources, and it's really focused on designing engaging work. And as we talk about designing engaging work, universal design for learning is all about making sure that we give options for engagement, that we give options for representation and give options for action and expression. So I'm going to ask you to put a 0 in the chat if you have never heard of universal design for learning, and it's okay if you haven't. I'll ask you to put a 1 if you know a little bit about it, and a 2 if you can teach a class on it. 0, 1, or 2. All right. I love it. 0.5. Awesome. Thank you. So no matter if you are at the beginning of your learning journey with UDL, if you know just a little bit about it, or if you can teach the class looking at it through the lens of equity, particularly anti-racism, you'll have some different ways to think about it. So as we think about universal design for learning, if you're in the early childhood sector, then you get to be the first voice of helping learners become expert learners. And so multiple means of engagement means that learners will have purpose and motivation for entering into the new learning. They'll be motivated by the mastery of learning. They'll be goal directed in their learning. They'll know how to set challenging learning goals for themselves and know how to sustain that effort and resilience that reaching those goals will require. They'll learn about themselves. What do I do when I'm frustrated? What should I do when I don't know what to do? Do I have a plan? And then learn more about themselves as they navigate through. That's multiple means of engagement. Multiple means of representation means that learners are resourceful and knowledgeable. That just means that we will give them multiple ways to take in the content. I always think of engagement as navigating through, representation is taking the learning in. And so can they customize for themselves? Is there prior knowledge that we're inviting to the table? And if it's not there, are we supplying that background knowledge? Are we giving them a way to activate, to identify, and to organize what they already know in order to ease into that new learning, like an on-ramp? Recognizing tools and resources that will help them find structure or remember new information. And so that is where learners realize maybe they want to take a picture of something, or maybe they want to have it read to them out loud or interact with it kinesthetically. And as they learn themselves, they'll know what they need to do in order to learn new things. And then we know how to transform new information into meaningful and useful information. So once I learn the sound of the letter M, how does that help me? How can I put that learning to work? Where do I see M's? What do I do? How do I know when to make that sound? And then action and expression, strategic and goal-directed learners. That means that each learner can formulate their plan for learning, that they have a strategy and a tactic to make sure that they can show what they know, that they know how to use the resources that they have in order to achieve the goal that they've set, that they know how to monitor their progress, to give themselves a dot or to check something off when they have made it. And they know when something doesn't work for them, that they can think through that and abandon plans that are ineffective. And so that is the goal of becoming an expert learner. We talked last time about power and honor. And so I just want to refresh you on honor, on recognizing the power structures that exist, both past and present, and then abolishing the limitation of those power structures. Honor is empowering each member of the learning community daily in our structures, supports, and choices. And so we talked about seating options. We talked about camera options or participation options, homework options. And as we talk about family next week, I'll talk a little bit more about homework remixed in. But we have to take ourselves, we who have power, who are in positions of authority, take ourselves out of power to give each learner the chance to make decisions for themselves. And so we have to create these opportunities for learners to govern their best possible outcome, evaluate their decisions, give flexibility, how we communicate, give choice on assignments. And so as you think about the early childhood setting, I want you to think about goals. How do you know that your goal is clear? These are some questions for you to think through. So each of you, when you set your learning targets or your learning goals, how do you know that your goal is clear? How do you know that your goal is relevant? How do you know that your goal is rigorous? And what do you see or hear to indicate that all learners understand the goal? And so I want you to think about a learning target, a learning goal that you have for your classroom. These are reflection questions to take a lesson plan that you already have. And if you're watching the recording of this or you're using this for staff development, this is a great tool to take out a lesson plan and really walk yourself through. How do you know? And what is the stated goal? And what are some observations about that goal? What will you look for to know that that goal is met? So just take a moment to think about, how do you know that the goal is clear? And you can share in the chat, or you can draw or write on the slide if you're using the interactive slides. These are things for you to consider as you develop learning goals for your students. The next thing I want you to think about is options. Are there options for engagement, representation, and action and expression? And if so, how do they support all students? And if you haven't thought about culture and background, I want you to take a look at that wheel of power and privilege that we talked about in session 1 and go back to that. Who has the power in your classroom? Who is marginalized and pushed out? And so do the options directly address the anticipated barrier? Have you thought about what the barriers will be to accessing? Are there options of equal rigor? Even if the opportunities and the activities are different, is the rigor equal? And do the options support the achievement of the goal? Sometimes we can get caught up in really cute activities, but they don't support the achievement of the goal. And I want you to think about Richie Parker. Each of the accommodations, each of the extensions, each of the options helped him to meet the goal, whether it was to design cars using his feet to draw, or whether it was to drive them. He met the goal. And so how do we support all students as they achieve the goal? The third area that I would like you to think through is, what unintentional barriers do you notice that prevent or might prevent learners from achieving the goal? I want you to consider how we could use UDL to reduce or remove these barriers. And so, what barrier do you anticipate or see in the curriculum, in the goals, the methods, the materials, the assessments, the environment? And are there exemplars or examples of Black, Brown, and Indigenous people in the curricula, in the goals, in the methods, the material? Are students able to see themselves as the picture of success? And then as you think about the barriers, you can take a look at the guidelines to see, how can I meet the needs of the students? How can we reduce or remove these barriers with UDL, with our design, with flexible seating? What barriers are there? And then how do we remove those barriers? And which specific option could be provided to remove or reduce the barrier? And so let's think about one barrier in particular that I hear about a lot. And so attention. Students may struggle to attend for long periods of time. So how do we identify that as a barrier? We talk about it, and then we say, okay, what can we do in our design to eliminate that barrier? So what could we do to eliminate that barrier? We could do smaller learning episodes. We can give options for standing or sitting. We can introduce some assistive technology like the little bouncy cords that we can put on the chairs, or giving students a chance to sit on the swivel seats if they choose them for themselves. Many times these are things that are prescribed to learners, instead of introducing them to a menu of options and allowing them to try them for themselves to see if they reach the goal that they set for themselves. So, expert learning. I want you to think about what evidence suggests the learning environment is promoting the development of expert learning for all. Who is succeeding? Who is celebrated? Who is making decisions for themselves? In what ways are learners supported to be purposeful, motivated, resourceful, and knowledgeable, strategic, and goal-directed? And so as you evaluate your lesson plans, I want you to think about observations on the promotion of expert learning. Who is learning about themselves? How is that learning transferring? How are we inviting home to share with us what's successful there that we can use together in the classroom? And how are we sending home success the students had in the classroom for parents at home? As we think about multiple means of engagement, multiple means of representation, and multiple means of action and expression, we have to think about the relationships that we're building, that we have to communicate for building relationships. We have to communicate with our learners, with families, with community. And universal design for learning helps us to think about culturally responsive communication. It helps us to think about restorative practices in communication, and ultimately think about anti-racism, anti-ableism, and anti-oppressionism as we work together. And so these two roads create one expressway. Universal design for learning and anti-racism come together and merge to create anti-racist UDL, where we think about equity as we think about the design that we give to our students. And so which road did you travel first? Was it anti-racism or was it UDL? Which one did you learn about first? You could type your answer in the chat. Thank you. And no matter which road you travel first, as you learn more, as you develop your practice, as you learn more about how to question your design, those roads begin to merge, because you can't truly have an anti-racist environment if it's not universally designed, and you can't have a universally designed learning environment if it's not anti-racist or anti-biased. And so how does UDL provide a vehicle to advance equity work? UDL develops students' familiarity with the codes of power by explicitly and thoughtfully incorporating success into the fabric of all core instructional offerings. The core then will create an internal value to school success for students that does not contradict other critical dimensions of themselves. Go ahead and type in the chat which words stand out from this quote, or you can draw on the interactive slides. We'll circle the words or type the words into the chat. Which words stand out as a vehicle to advance equity work with UDL? Thank you, Andrea. Thank you. Dimensions, incorporating success, explicit, thoughtful, critical dimensions, thoughtfully. And so when we think about the codes of power, we have to make students familiar with barriers. We have to make them familiar with what is success. Find out what success is to them. Not just what you want to be when you grow up, but what do you want to accomplish today? What will make you proud of you? When a learning environment is truly anti-racist and universally designed, then all learners will be empowered beyond bias to make decisions about their learning and leading, because the environment is welcoming and safe. Students won't have to become anyone else in order to be the picture of success to themselves. That we'll release our biases to trust them to make decisions, that we'll work with them and guide them so that they will learn how to make decisions for themselves. In the book, I said that we cannot, in good conscience or in good teaching, stand by and watch another generation be marginalized because we don't take action. Tonight is about action. It's about going through your own lessons and your own design to ask yourself the questions: does it hurt enough for me to change? Does it hurt enough for me to design differently? Inaction is agreement. Inaction is racism. Inaction is injustice. Inaction is inhumane. Inaction for us is not an option. And so we go back to that question: does it hurt enough for us to change? We know what the data tells us. We know what the data shows us, and more students will be able to remain in a regular education setting if we design like Richie Parker's parents did for him, if we make them the chief engineer of solutions. That spirit of inclusion and belonging will teach each of us that we are going to make it. And so I'm going to ask you a question, and I'm going to ask you to, this is a sentence stem that you can use to fill in the chat as we reflect on what we've talked about tonight. I have used my power to blank. Now I will choose to honor by blank. I have used my power to make decisions for how students take in learning. And now I will choose to honor by offering options to my students so that they can choose how they want to learn for themselves. What about you? Take about 2 minutes to reflect, and you can type the STEM into the chat, or you can write your response on the interactive slide. You decide. This is your chance to share your voice. Thank you. I see all of your answers coming in, both in the chat and on the interactive slides. I'll just read a few. I've used my power to lead students. I will now honor students by having them set up learning goals for themselves. I've used my power to direct others, but now I will choose to honor by listening and supporting. I've used my power to empower. Now I will choose to honor by having a voice for the marginalized. I've used my power to make changes that benefit and support all students under my care. Now I choose to honor by actively seeking out from their families the best ways to do this within the educational system. Thank you. I've used my power to bring experience and knowledge into the classroom. Now I will choose to honor by supporting the experience and knowledge of my students and their families. This is educational justice in action. And so as you think about how you will use your power to impact their honor, it changes their story. And so as we think about how do we partner with teachers, with paraprofessionals, with families, with technology supports, with design, so that the road is no longer dangerous to those who are most vulnerable, to those who have been marginalized and pushed out to the borders of education, how we can pull them in and engage them by allowing them to choose how they want to learn and where they want to take charge for themselves. They can do it. We are going to make it work. And so when hearing the phrase, does it hurt enough to change? What data comes to mind first for you? Which experiences come to mind for your learners? And what did you hear today that sparked a desire to change your own design? If you have questions, this is the time for you to place them into the chat. We have time for a few, but as you reflect, as you maybe pause this video or go back to this slide to think about what will be different for you. How will you universally design? How will you question your design to make sure that the road is not dangerous? I would like to thank you for your time this evening. I'm going to peek into the Q&A to see if we have any questions, but I want to help you to see that universal design for learning and anti-racism are intermarried, that it is a partnership, that equity is universal design for learning and universal design for learning is equity when we question ourselves, our motives and our biases and release them to the students to move from the prison realm up to the learning organization where we earn their attention and commitment with our design that reflects the brilliance that they bring to the table. So I want to share with you and end just like we began with a poem from Tupac Shakur, brilliant, genius, rapper, poet, Shakespeare in the making. He said, "Did you hear about the rose that grew from a crack in the concrete? Proving nature's law is wrong. It learned to walk without having feet. Funny it seems, but by keeping its dreams, it learned to breathe fresh air. Long live the rose that grew from concrete when no one else ever cared." Tonight, we declare that we care and that for all the roses who are growing in the midst of concrete, we will be careful to blast away at those barriers until they can grow and bloom freely, not restricted by our design, but free to make the changes, make the decisions, use the power because we choose to honor them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andratesha, as always, just incredible and inspiring and always leaving us with work to do, right? we have things to address, acknowledge, work on, own it, and create that change going forward. So we really appreciate everything that you share with us each time that we get together. So we will be getting together again next Tuesday, same time, 3 to 4, same internet link, Zoom link. So please feel free to check in with us again to explore more and learn together. So we'll be together session 3 on Tuesday, session 4, our final session will be on Thursday. So if you missed any portion of today, it is going to be posted on that Padlet. So save that Padlet link. And I believe Juliet's dropping that in the chat for us as well. So we keep that fresh and we will see you very soon. So everybody have a great weekend ahead and see you on Tuesday. Thank you again, Andratesha.
Thank you all. You can go to my website, Building Blocks of Brilliance, or follow on Twitter at Fritz